diseases, which is sad, but it was not that unusual in those days. We had no vaccinations or medications that were developed later. Eddie died in 1850. I shouldn't say this, she doesn't like to hear me talk about Du Bois. Brings back bad memories, but he died in 1850. He was only 4 years old. And fortunately, within the year, we had Willie. About 11 months later, Willie was born. And we were so happy that we brought Willie in.
In many ways, Willie is the epitome of what I believe Mr. Lincoln was as a child. He got along with everybody. He knew, truthfully, how to be older than his little years were. He was compassionate and loving, always. Our poor boys, according to many who've looked back on us, making comments like, we probably weren't the best parents. We let our children basically run wild. I don't think either you or I ever felt that way, did we, Mr. Lincoln?
You mean that we were not good parents?
Yes, sir.
I would only plead guilty to being indulging. And I used to let Tad sit on my lap while I had cabinet meetings. But he usually was not content to sit on my lap, but rather he would hop off and run around shooting his gun or something around the tables where we were having the meeting, or he would play under my desk. And the cabinet members, some of them, were not happy that I allowed him to do so, but I would tell them I have so little time to spend with my son, and he was all alone at that time. It was just he and I in the White House. I said I do not want to begrudge him even these few moments.
Taddy was also special. Taddy was special. He helped me after the death of Father. I went overseas for a while and trying to just basically find myself. I worried a great deal. I worried about expenses, lack of money, holding up finances that should have been mine, I believe, but that many in Congress were willing to accept. I did go on shopping sprees. Mr. Lincoln will attest to that. I couldn't help it. It was just like, it was the time when I truly felt at peace. Too many curtains, way too many curtains. And I saved everything, even the clothes and the bonnets that I put away in chests that we'd had when we were first married. I admit, after 4 children, the weight stayed. Those clothes would never be ones I could wear again. But I think it was truly a crutch for me, a means to say, I'm okay. I have the bonnets. I have the jewelry. I have the curtains.
She did a splendid job furnishing our home in Springfield. And see, while we lived in Springfield and I still practiced law, I was away 3 months out of every 6, writing the 8th Judicial Circuit in Illinois. And so Mrs. Lincoln had the boys to raise and the house to care for. And one time I gave her permission to expand the house, and we added several bedrooms, including a room for a maid. We had a maid that stayed with us, a number of different young ladies that would come in to help her with care of the house, although she insisted on cooking herself. And she was a very good cook. This was one of the humorous things when we were packing to leave for Washington finally. She had an argument with me that she insisted on taking our stove. And I had to tell her finally, I said, Mary, you will have someone to cook for you at the White House. You won't have to cook. But she still wanted to take our own stove because she was so comfortable with it. But I finally prevailed on her, and we did leave it behind. We had left our house all furnished and rented it out for the duration of our presidency. And if you ever visit my home in Springfield, you can go through it. And most of the furnishings are the same furnishings that she had purchased. We had only one financial rule in our home, and that was that I would earn the money and Mary would spend it.
Worked well, most of the time.
And gentlemen here in the audience here, that's sage advice to each of you.
Thank you.
Mama ain't happy?
That
Nobody happy. But many things you may not know about her that go unreported, and what I am most proud of my wife is that several times a week during the course of the war, she would visit the hospitals where our wounded soldiers were, and she usually did this anonymously. And she would visit with the soldiers, and for those that could not do so, she would write letters home to them.
It definitely was an eye-opener for me. I know that many that surround us in Washington, D.C. see me as uncouth, even a Westerner, which I have trouble understanding, based on the fact my background is definitely not the West. But going, writing the letters, holding someone's hand for a period of time, I'm hoping that for all of us, there could be a sense of release, a sense of understanding better what the Civil War was all about. Yes, my family is Southern in outlook, but I know as a child growing up, my maternal grandmother was very, very much into freedom of slavery, freeing the slaves, the whole emancipation idea, and even the Underground Railroad. When I married Mr. Lincoln, it pushed me into circles that initially would make me uncomfortable because I didn't feel as if I would fit in. And I will admit, many didn't try to help me fit in. Did they, Father?
Oh, that is true.
You always told me.
Particularly when we got to Washington City.
Yes. That was a real eye-opener for me.
But you were not accepted because you were attached to me. There is little doubt that I did not have a cultured upbringing.
That's your Mr. Lincoln. And I told you, you would be president. That one day I would be
You
married
often
to
did.
the President of the United
You
States.
often did. And yet until late 1859, I had no desire to be president. I only wanted to be a senator. Many people think I grew up dreaming of being president. But at the time of my political heyday, there were no great presidents. From the time of Andrew Jackson until I was elected president, we had a string of presidents that did nothing and were not acclaimed for anything, whereas all of the great men were senators. And my greatest ambition at that time was to become a senator. And when I failed to secure the Senate seat against Judge Stephen Douglas in 1858, and then I traveled the country as a representative of my party for the next 2 years, people start talking to me about the presidency in 1860, and I suddenly developed a desire for it. And by the middle of 1859, I was probably publicly doing things to enhance my reputation and might lead to my election as president. And she was pushing me
I was.
quite strenuously in that direction.
I knew you would be good at it. I knew it.
Now, you all remember that we're having a program tonight as well, right? At 7 o'clock at the Heritage Museum. We'd like as many of you to come. Bring your spouses and your family members too. And I will give a speech at that. And there will be a question and answer for as long as you wish to ask. But you can ask questions here too. You can get a head start. You don't have to wait on us to come up with a few little stories. Unless you think we're doing well enough as it is. But we don't know if we're addressing things that might be of interest to each of you.
goes with our exhibit. Tell us what the Constitution said about slavery.
The Constitution essentially said nothing about slavery, and I always referred to this while I was campaigning for president or interested in the presidency. I must clarify, when I ran for president, I did not actively campaign. Once we established a platform, in those days, a man did not campaign for the president. It was considered undignified. I never made a single speech or a public appearance from the time I was nominated until I was elected as president. I stayed at home in Springfield, but representatives of me and my party went into their parts of the country to campaign. But to go back to her question about the Constitution and slavery, this is what I believed, and when I made my first inaugural speech, I tried to clarify to the southern states that I, as president, had no constitutional authority to affect the institution of slavery where it currently existed and in the states where it currently existed, because that power is reserved to the states by the Constitution of the United States. There's a clause in there that says, if it is not specifically addressed in this Constitution, the power to regulate that falls to the states. And I tried to clarify that. But I also tried to clarify that the Constitution gave me the power to preserve and protect all of the United States and its property. And when I took my oath, I promised to preserve and protect the Constitution and the states. And what the southern states were doing violated that and gave me the responsibility to intervene or to do what was necessary. See, the southern states, when they seceded, they confiscated federal territories and properties, federal forts, federal arsenals, and that was a violation of the Constitution that I was vowed to preserve and protect as President of the United States. I further went in my first inaugural address to tell the southern states, though, that I would not be the first aggressor. And I concluded by saying, in your hands, my fellow countrymen, lie the momentous issue of civil war. And of course, about a month later, the southern states tried to take Fort Sumter and fired on Fort Sumter, and that was the first shot of the war, and I was obliged then to mobilize the Union forces in defense of the Constitution and the country. I also believe, though, every state had agreed to that Constitution, and there is no clause in the Constitution also that gives a state the power or the right or the authority to unilaterally withdraw from that agreement. The only way you can amend the Constitution is by agreement of 3/4 of the states. Now, had the South come to the rest of the Union and said, we would like to amend the Constitution to allow us to withdraw, and all the other states agreed, then it would have been done legally. But by them unilaterally withdrawing from that document, it was not allowed. And I fought to preserve the Union and the Constitution, and that's why I allowed the war to proceed. Easiest thing for me to do would have been to wash my hands of the South and allow them to separate. Now, only history can tell whether or not my decision was the right decision. Are we better because we have a single United States of America, or would we have been better if we had looked like Europe and had 6 or 8 countries across this continent? Would we be as strong? Would we be still the greatest nation on earth? Well, we couldn't be one great nation. We'd have been 6 or 8 nations. But to me, that is my legacy as well. Where do you go? Okay.
I'm back.
Did I get there
You did.
in my roundabout way?
Yeah.
Okay. I threw some other things too probably in there. Do we have any other questions?
What was the best day of your presidency and the worst day of your presidency?
There were a lot of worse days, so it may take me a moment to tell you the very worst one. But the best day was April 14th. It was the first day I was really starting to relax. April 10th and 11th were very good too, when all the word came back of the surrender of General Lee at Appomattox. But it was building. Day by day it was getting better and better. And Mrs. Lincoln has already told you a little bit about our carriage ride, and that we were finally relaxed. It was perhaps the only time in my entire presidency that I could really relax, because when I was inaugurated president, already 7 states had left the Union. We weren't yet at war, but it appeared that war was inevitable. Despite my plea in my inauguration speech, it was inevitable. And it would be hard, sir, to say any day was sadder than that of the day our dear Willie died. And that set off a chain of many months of sorrow in the White House. And for Mrs. Lincoln, there was little she could focus on, and it drove her into a year's worth of mourning. For me, I still had, in early 1862, the sake of the country and the war, and I was able to separate myself during the day from my grief and concentrate on the task at hand.
If I might, Mr. Lincoln.
Certainly.
In that time period, too, I fell back much on religion and then went a step further, some said way too deep, into spirituality, what at that point would have been called spirituality, which in my mind, I don't know. Depends on which historian you read about Mary Todd Lincoln. Was this the beginning of insanity? Was this the step in that direction? I swore at times, through hallucinations, through dreams, through drugs, through not, who knows, that I saw my sons, that I saw some of my Southern family. You must understand, my mother died before I was 7. My father, shortly thereafter, married again. He had 9 more children with his second wife. My personality as a child was one that evidently required validation often. I did not feel that I was given it often enough. Perhaps that's part of the reason that I pursued the idea of marriage and wanting children so desperately. All 4 children I loved. I don't think my first, Robert, was ever super close. You may disagree, Mr. Lincoln. But to me, I don't feel that feeling was there. Willie, we both did. Desperate times then. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, typhoid fever. All 3 ugly, ugly deaths for 3 of our 4 children. To discover after Lincoln's death, now please understand, this occurred on Good Friday. So when Mr. Lincoln said that was part of the best day he had ever had, I agree. We were discussing the future. We were talking plans for ourselves when this horrible, almost an abyss that had come about was going to be gone, and we could be on our own, together. And it's also going to be, in many ways, the end for me. I really felt like what's left. Many will criticize me later for my lack, perhaps, of true understanding of politics, although I loved every bit that Mr. Lincoln, father, allowed me to hear and be a part of. I'm sure at times
Well,
I
you
did
certainly
help.
would tell me some too.
I know that. And now I question, did I go too far? At times I've wondered.
Well, certainly not during our courtship.
Thank you.
You may not know, but this lovely lady had her pick of any beau in Springfield back when we were courting. She was considered the loveliest catch. And how this ugly old fella ended up with her is beyond my ken. But I think much of it had to do with the fact that she was intelligent and wished to show that to the men, and most of the men of my generation only wanted their women to look pretty and sit quiet and demurely,
Like that would
and
happen?
perhaps go bake cookies now and then. But I was willing to allow her to sit and talk politics with me. That was almost forbidden for a woman to talk politics, and I so enjoyed her company and was so flattered that she paid me any attention, and the fact that I was totally tongue-tied around women, that worked in my favor, because I could sit there for hours and be fascinated by her chatter, and she thought, and I did respect her discussions, but at the same time, I was too afraid to interject myself, but I was just happy to be in her company. And I think that may be what helped me win her hand.
My ring. I know it's the time period when, well, romance was seen in a different light. However, Mr. Lincoln did have his moments. One in particular would go to my grave with me, and that's the inscribed, "Love is forever," inside of my ring.
To go back to some of the worst things, because I really didn't get to that except to mention the day of Willie's death. It would be hard to come up with any day worse than that. And it also was occurring, he was dying while we were hosting a huge reception in the White House at the very same evening that he was on his deathbed. And Mrs. Lincoln constantly had to excuse herself, and I did a few times too to check on Willie's progress. But the other thing that greatly distressed me was the casualties that we had in the war. And that's why I say there were so many days that were distressing. The casualties that came back from so many of the battles, Fredericksburg and Antietam and Gettysburg, and the two battles in Bull Run, was just always distressing news. Even those battles where we had some success, the casualty count was just horrific. And I never knew how to deal with that. Now, I told you how Mrs. Lincoln visited the hospitals. I didn't go so often, but I did go in whatever chances I could, so that I could shake the hands of the men and talk to them and thank them and express my concern and my appreciation for the efforts of our brave soldiers. I more so enjoyed going to the camps and seeing the soldiers parade and lined up and going through and talking to the soldiers before battles. And I took every effort or every opportunity to visit the soldier encampments as well, and was quite pleased with the reception that the soldiers gave me. But I would have to say a multitude of worse days, and most of them coincided with battles and the casualty counts that came in as a result of those battles, and it would be hard to say one day was worse than another day.
One of the issues that hit us as parents, as well as being President of the United States, and the first, well, spoken of First Lady, had to be when Robert, our oldest, wanted to become a part of the military. Mr. Lincoln realized way ahead of me that the need was there, that the show of force was there, that he needed to be a part of it. The mother and me, I had a rough time with that. Kept holding out over and over when Robert would ask, literally begging us.
That is true. That led to some serious discussions between she and I, because Robert's point was valid. He told me that I was forcing so many sons, and many sons of congressmen were fighting too. In fact, many congressmen were fighting. Many resigned from Congress to take commissions in the military. And he told me he felt he needed to be there because the son of the president should not be a shirker and should not be on the sidelines. And sometimes I agreed with that. And then we instituted a draft in 1863 yet, and my son still was not in the service. See, he was in college at that time, and it was only his mother that finally prevailed on him that he should stay and finish college, and then he could join the service when that happened. Now, he had threatened, I think as early as 1862 or 63, to run away and enlist under an assumed name as a private somewhere to do his part. That's how he felt. And he probably would have done so if it had only been me involved. I would not have been able to keep him in college, but his mother did prevail upon him. And when he did graduate late in 1864, I asked General Grant if he had a space for him on his staff, and General Grant said he would make him his aide. And I commissioned him a captain in the Army, and that's how Robert finished out the war. And Mrs. Lincoln mentioned that the morning of April 14th, he was invited to go to the theater to us. He had just arrived that very morning on a short leave from Appomattox. He actually was with General Grant when General Lee surrendered, and he had breakfast with us that morning, and I asked him to tell me a little bit about the surrender and to tell me about General Lee. And that too was a very pleasant conversation to hear from our son, who was actually able to witness that historic occasion. Now, he was not permitted in the farmhouse when the actual surrender occurred. He was not ranking high enough to have been present there, but he got to see some of what happened at the time General Lee surrendered. I was proud of him.
I was too. Scared for him, of course, as a mother, but still very proud. Perhaps feeling a tad sad that I'd made him kind of the brunt of jokes and various items from college that didn't do a great job of reinforcing mother-son love like it should have. Still, isn't it true, Mr. Lincoln? He was invited to the show that night.
Yes. And he had said he was tired from his travels and would prefer to remain home. And of course, we originally were going to Grover's Theater that night to see Aladdin, and we were taking Taddy over to see that play for young people. And you had prevailed upon me in the morning that we should change and go to Ford's Theater and see Our American Cousin. There was this very famous British actress by the name of Laura Keane, and this was going to be her 1000th performance in the lead role in that play, and it was listed as a special benefit. And you thought that would be an historic occasion, and it was a comedy, and we needed that relief. And so I gave you permission, and we had one of the staff members of the White House take our place, and he accompanied Taddy to Aladdin that night, so Tad did get to see that play almost to the end. But when you ordered the tickets, Ford's Theater then announced that the president was going to be there, and we told him also that General Grant and his wife were going to accompany us, but it wasn't till later that they told us they had plans. They had to travel out of town that afternoon to go back to New Jersey and visit with their family, so they had to be excused. But Ford's Theater then put out a playbill that afternoon throughout town, and their ticket sales went through the roof, and they had to add 200 extra temporary seats to accommodate everybody. I think that theater normally hold about 1,200 people, but they expanded it that evening for that special benefit and the fact that the President and Mrs. Lincoln were going to be present. But after our carriage ride, you came down with the migraine again.
I did.
And so many people say, didn't she force you to go to that play? I have to tell you, it was the exact opposite. When she came down with the migraine just around dinner time, she said, Father, I don't think I can go to the play. I think we should stay home. I was the one that forced her to go. I said, we have promised all of Washington to be there, and we really must go. Fortunately, by 8 p.m., the migraine was easing a bit. And I think had it not ended the way it ended, she would have agreed that it was a good decision to have gone to that play, because we really were getting comfortable in the presidential box and enjoying ourselves. Do we have any other questions? Oh, please, come on. Give us, yes, sir.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a circuit lawyer in Illinois, how that worked?
I certainly can. I was into that for a dozen or more years, 12, 15 years or so. But the way the circuit court worked in those days, all the judicial activity took place in the county courthouses or the county seats. And the 8th Judicial Circuit, of which I was attorney part of, at times had as few as 8 counties and as many as 14 counties. And we would run a 3-month circuit twice a year. And 8 to 10 lawyers and the judge. And the judge for most of that time was Dave Davis. We would all ride from town to town, and we would come into a county seat. He would set up the court in either a courthouse or a county building, and we would stay there anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks, depending on the size of the county and the docket we had. And in most cases, we did not know who our clients would be until we got to town, and that's when the clients would seek us out. Well, towards the end of my legal career, I got the bulk of the work on those circuits because I was considered the top lawyer, and perhaps even the top lawyer in the entire state of Illinois. So the people with the real big cases would seek me out, and I, of course, made the better fees in those cases. And we would discuss the cases and then present them, but they could be as little as a dispute over a $5 claim. In fact, perhaps one of my silliest but most commonsensical cases I had, a wealthy man came to me and complained that another man owed him $2.50. And he wanted me to represent him. And he said, "What's your fee?" I said, "Well, my fee is $10. And he said, "Fine." It was the principle of it. He gave me $10. I went to the other attorney and said, "Here's $5. You come to court and have your client pay the $2.50, and you get to keep the other $2.50. And that's what happened. And I made $5, the other attorney made $2.50, and my client got his $2.50 back for this debt that he thought was owed him. But that was part of the way that I approached some of my cases. Now, one of the other things that happened when we rode the circuit, of course, I was away from Mary during that entire time. Some of the attorneys would ride home on weekends, and on occasion I did, particularly later in my time, but early in that time, I used a lot of my circuit court riding for politicking and meeting people, so I would stay even over the weekends. Plus, early in my circuit court riding, I didn't think I was wealthy enough to go home, but we would stay in the boarding areas, which were usually above a tavern. And it was usually one big room with 5 or 6 beds in it. And after the court closed for the day, all the attorneys and the judge would have dinner in the tavern, and then we would sit around the fireplace in the tavern and tell stories into the wee hours, and everybody smoked and everybody drank except me. I was a non-smoker and a non-drinker my entire life. If we had to drive, I'd have been the designated driver, I suppose, in that group. But of course, we had no place to go but up into the giant bedroom, and we would sleep 2 or 3 to a bed, because that was customary too. There weren't enough beds for everybody, except for Judge Davis. Now, he got his own bed every time, but it wasn't because of his rank and the fact he was a judge. It was because he weighed 300 pounds. And nobody would share a bed with a 300-pound fella. Now, Judge Davis, I like to mention him because he happened to become my campaign manager in 1860. We were good friends, the judge and I, and he ran my campaign for president, and of course I was elected, and maybe this is patronage, but he was highly qualified. I later, in my first year as president, had a chance to appoint him to the United States Supreme Court. And so he finished his legal career as a Supreme Court justice.
Well, Mr. Lincoln was on his circuit routes, which, as he said, kept him away from home for quite a period of time. And of course, we'd started our family, our first beginning boys. And I will admit, I kind of by trial and error learned how to be a better wife and a better mother. But I truly did have a few, well,
Issues?
there, that will work, Mr. Lincoln, thank you, that required assistance. One of them being, I didn't like to be the only adult in the house after dark. Two, I did not like when Mr. Lincoln would return and bring a friend and not tell me about it. And I prided myself on being a pretty good cook and a pretty good housekeeper. But certainly, it would have been nice to know in advance. He did not always understand the reasoning behind my tantrums over such issues as that. And as maybe a way to appease me, more than once, he found neighborhood boys, ones that would be available if he knew it was going to storm, because I was a frightened person, even as an adult of storms. If he knew he was going to be away for a great length of time, he would let the neighbors know, and they would come check on me. So again, I know there was love there. I truly believe it. I like the politics as well, which is, Mr. Lincoln said, was not always the best thing for a female during this period, to really be outstating. So that I think only getting to go to really one winter lodging area when you were involved in Congress, that was a little rough, I must admit. And then having to return with the boys and be alone, and realizing money-wise, time-wise, pretty much every way, it wasn't working well for me to be where I was, but to return back and try to make it work.
And when I mentioned that I was out and didn't come home from weekends on the circuit early in my career, that was when our two oldest boys were with Mary at home. And in the 1850s, when Willie and Tad came along, I came back home quite a bit more frequently. And I think really it was Eddie's death in 1850 that probably changed my mind on that too, when I suddenly realized how fragile young life was, and that I didn't want to miss that part of my two youngest boys growing up. And of course they grew up much closer to me than did Robert. Robert probably never really forgave me for not being around when he was young, and was probably jealous of my attentions to Tad and to Willie. One of the days, though, I should maybe tell this at my own expense, Mother.
Go for it, Father.
I used to take the boys to the legal office in Springfield and often took them in a wagon. And I think Taddy was about 3 years old, and Willie would have been about 6. And one night I was coming home from the law office and pulling them in the wagon, and I was reading a book, as I sometimes did, and being absent-minded, and somehow I think little Taddy slipped out of that wagon about halfway home. And I entered the gate to our home, and Mrs. Lincoln was waiting for me on the porch, and she looked at the wagon, and only Willie was in it, and said, "Where's Tad?" And we both looked up the street, and about 3 blocks away comes little Taddy trudging along as fast as his little legs could go. She grabbed the skillet and chased me all the way down the street to where Taddy was.
I had to reinforce the problem, yes? You had to take care of the problem.
That may have been one day I deserved that skillet. But one thing you have to understand about my wife was when she married me, she definitely married me for better and for worse. Before she married me, she came from a very wealthy home in Lexington, Kentucky. In fact, as a child, she mentioned a little bit about her extended family, that she had a mother and a stepmother, and her father had, 6 children with your first mother, and 9 with the other? So there were 15 children. They had slaves, although they did manumit those slaves. Was it right after your father passed away? In the 1850s, so before the Civil War, her family no longer owned slaves. But she grew up, she had her own slave as a child, because each of the children would have their own slave to take care of the children. And then when she came to Springfield, she lived with her older sister Elizabeth, who was married to the wealthiest man, Ninian Edwards, in Springfield, and lived in the biggest mansion in town. And then she married me November 4th of 1842, and on our wedding night, she moved into a one-room apartment above the town saloon. And
But we had plans.
9 months later, she had her first little baby
Robert.
and was left all alone while I'm riding the circuit with the squalling little infant. And of course, she had to suddenly start darning my socks and doing my laundry. I think the only domestic chore you might have enjoyed was the cooking.
Yes, I did enjoy it.
But once we bought our home on 8th and Jackson Street, things started to get a little better. And she had the pride of being able to fix up that home and furnish that home. And when we expanded it, and I finally was making enough money to afford a maid, I think that finally helped her to settle down into that domestic life. Now, how many of you have been to my home in Springfield? Anybody? Did you enjoy it?
It was beautiful.
Do you understand me a little better by seeing that home? And you know, we were one of the wealthiest families in Springfield by the time I was elected president. Contrary to many people's belief that I was a poor man, I was considered quite wealthy at that time. And as a sign of my wealth, do you remember what's in my backyard? I had a 3-hole privy.
Okay.
Most homes would only have a 1-holer, but we had a 3-holer, which was a sign of considerable wealth and status. True?
You could be a social animal too.
These young people don't even know what I'm talking about. You know what a privy is?
It's a bathroom.
Some people call it an outhouse. You know what an outhouse is? They won't even know what that is.
Probably not.
Back when I was president and alive, no home had indoor plumbing. An outhouse was a bathroom. It was a hole in the ground covered by a little wooden shed. And the toilet was a little wooden seat over the hole in the ground.
Oh, gosh.
And little kids had to be careful because you could slip through it
And
and
fall
then
in
you
it.
yelled and yelled and yelled till somebody came and got you out.
Oh, gosh.
Nasty.
And most homes only had a single seat in theirs, but that's where I had such status. I had three thrones. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What do you think is your most influential speech?
My most influential speech.
Made a lot of them, but.
Well, of course, history will tell you which speech was my most influential speech.
Gettysburg.
Yes, the speech that I made at Gettysburg. Everyone calls, I have children come up to me sometimes and say, do you know the Gettysburg Address? I say, well, certainly I do. They say, well, what is it? I say, well, it was 221 West 5th Street. Because, of course, in my lifetime, we would have just called it the speech that I gave at Gettysburg. But, of course, history records it as the Gettysburg Address. Certainly, it would be hard to pick a speech that was better than that or more influential. And today, you couldn't go away from that speech because it's the one that's remembered and repeated. and children memorize it, and it is a very good speech. But many real historians believe that my best speech was my second inaugural. Okay, that it really laid out, because that came 2 years later, or a year and a half later, after Gettysburg, and it really took the Gettysburg speech one step further in terms of the country and its future and where do we go from here, because that was the speech of reconciliation. It was a speech to say it's time to become a single country again, and here's how we're going to do it. It also laid out the fact that the war and slavery was the burden, responsibility, and fault of both North and South. And if you read that, that's what I stress in there, that we both have earned whatever, or we both deserved whatever we had earned by permitting the existence of slavery and this war to come upon us. Part of the speech is sad, but part of it is hopeful. And you must remember, though, at the time I gave that second inaugural, the war wasn't over yet. And I even indicate in that speech that it still may be an indeterminate time. I did not know or even think that it was going to end about a month later. As I say, fondly do we hope and fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war will go away. But I didn't know how soon that would happen. And if you go to my memorial in Washington, D.C., that speech is on the opposite wall. Those are the two speeches that are put on those walls, and that is because those are my two greatest speeches. And they're both short.
And they're both short.
The one at Gettysburg was about 3 minutes, and the one at the second inaugural was about 10 minutes. But if you went to one of my real speeches, they were 2 hours.
Okay.
Any questions back there?
About posing the question you asked me yesterday about the treaty.
Oh, okay. She wants me to query you. I get to ask you a question. Is there anybody in here can tell me when and where the treaty that ended the Civil War was signed? I'm not getting any hands up in the air. Normally somebody says April 9th at Appomattox, because that's the day General Lee surrendered to General Grant. But that's not the answer, because that was only a surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia, the army that General Lee commanded. And at the time that happened, there were still several Southern armies engaged in fighting the war, and the last significant one to surrender was General Joe Johnston more than 3 weeks later, or about 3 weeks later, to General Sherman. But we did in Washington consider the war basically won once General Lee. He was the army we needed to get out of the way. And actually, as soon as Lee surrendered, Jefferson Davis had told General Johnston to split his army into guerrilla bands and send them off to fight indefinitely. And fortunately for this country, General Joe Johnston was a gentleman much the same as General Lee, and determined in his own mind a couple weeks later that further bloodshed was just not in the best interest of anyone. So I didn't get any answers yet, so I better tell you the answer. It's a trick question. There never was a treaty to end the Civil War. But the next question is, why was there never a treaty?
There was never a declaration of war, or, well,
Close.
well, okay.
Yeah, the biggest reason there was never a treaty, to have a treaty at the end of the war, you need 2 sovereign nations to sign it. And our federal government, and me in particular,